Good evening. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the 2020 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Legacy Convocation. I'm Kenyatta Schamberger, and I serve as the Assistant Dean of Students and Director of the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs. The university's annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Legacy Convocation provides an opportunity for the ISU community to pause, honor, and celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. King. And in our celebration, let us not miss the reality that Dr. King was a great man not merely because of his words, but also because of his work. And the price of greatness, which emanates from work, is immeasurably expensive and ineffably burdensome. May our recognition of Dr. King's legacy serve as a reminder, especially for those of us engaged in equity work, to continue the fight for justice, even in those moments when our work is unpopular and politically inexpedient. During tonight's program, we'll recognize Iowa State colleagues who are committed to Dr. King's dream of creating an inclusive community that embraces justice and equity for all persons. We'll also hear from author, historian, professor, and scholar, Dr. Ibram Kendi. This program is a celebration, a time of reflection, and a call to action. Dr. King's legacy should be remembered, revered, and emulated. And at this time, it's my pleasure to bring to the podium Austin Graber, the student government president, who will offer words of welcome. Austin.
Good evening, students, faculty, and staff, and welcome to the 2020 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Convocation. My name is Austin Graber, and I currently serve as the student body president here at Iowa State University. The purpose of the convocation is to continue Dr. King's global vision of equality for everyone and reminding us that his vision still remains relevant today. Celebrating this event is especially important here at Iowa State University as we continue to strive for a truly diverse and inclusive environment. I am extremely honored to be a part of this event filled with awards, recognizing groups and individuals who have followed Dr. King's principles, and wrapping up with a powerful keynote speaker. Not only will we individually benefit from this event, but the entire Iowa State community benefits, so I would like to thank you all for taking part in tonight's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin, for your remarks and for your leadership. Before we move further into our program, I have a few housekeeping items to note. When you have a crowd this size, of course, there are some housekeeping issues, right? Okay, just want to make sure. For those that may be attending tonight's program for class credit, a lectures program employee will swipe your ID following the conclusion of the event, and they'll be set up in the lobby of the Great Hall. Also, tonight, the University Bookstore is selling copies of Dr. Kendi's books right to my left, to your right, in the Oak Room. And there will also be refreshments after the program, and Dr. Kendi will be signing his books. Immediately following the conclusion of the lecture, you may begin to line up for the book signing. There will also be an opportunity following Dr. Kendi's remarks for questions, for a question and answer period. We have microphones set up in the front of the room to my left and to my right that will be used for that portion of the program. And finally, for those taking photos during the lecture or the Q&A, we're requesting that you please do not use flashes. And now, Dr. Reginald Chen Stewart, Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion, is coming to present the 2020 Martin Luther King Jr. Advancing One Community Awards. Following the awards presentation, Carmen R. Jones, a fourth-year doctoral student in the School of Education, will introduce our keynote speaker. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stewart to the podium.
Good evening. All right, is this thing on? Good evening. There we go. Wake up, family. So it is my honor to introduce the recipients of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Advancing One Community Award. I would like to extend a special thank you to Nikki Port and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion for coordinating this effort. Our honorees have demonstrated a tireless commitment to the principles of Dr. King. Through their leadership, their courage, they have worked to bring about change at Iowa State University and the Ames community. Before I introduce the recipients, I want to take a moment to thank every single one of you in this room and every single person who advances the principles of Dr. King without award, without ceremony, and you just do the work. We applaud you, we appreciate you, and we look forward to continuing and supporting your efforts. Your presence today underscores my belief that there will always be more good in this world than there is evil. So I gave some thought how I wanted to express the appreciation for our candidates, for our awardees, but we wanted to change it up a bit this year. Now in the past, what I've done is I've taken a quote from Dr. King and attributed it to our awardees. This year we have quotes from a wide range of people that reflect the work that you've done. So our first recipient is Nisha Carrington. Nisha, would you please come up? So Nisha is a doctoral student in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. Let me repeat that. Come on up, girls. Nisha is a doctoral student in the Department of Electrical and Chemical Engineering. I think that, okay. That's the reaction I wanted. But to tell you more about this amazing woman, I'd like to invite to the stage two of her first LEGO League back-to-back 2019-2020 Judges Award-winning team members to recognize the person that they affectionately call Coach. Jesse, Nia, come on.
So, in case you haven't figured it out already, because we're horrible at hiding stuff, we're speaking here. Okay. Miss Carrington has been a mentor and one of the biggest female influences in all of our lives. She is not only a beautiful light, but she has guided us to be whoever we wanted to be. She has taught us many things, and we have taught her as well. She taught us to be slick and skillful in our work, and she has believed in each of us throughout everything we have done. Nisha Carrington, or Coach, has turned our team of Uptown girls into strong, powerful women, just like herself.
First of all, I would like to say that I speak for all of our LEGO League team when I say that I'm incredibly proud of everything Miss Nisha Carrington, our coach, has done in the past couple of years. She has been coaching our all-girls first LEGO League team into success, has been working long nights on getting her PhD, and has done all of this while being a positive influence on us as a strong leader who I trust and support. Coach has taught us that success isn't just working hard and smart, but also knowing when to take a deep breath. She has been a mentor and teacher to me, showing that you can be strong, smart, and powerful by working hard and being positive.
So, Coach, while the rest of your team comes up to take the picture, I have a quote that I want to read for you. Come on, girls, come up. You got to take the picture with her. So, Nisha, your quote comes from our shared appreciation of music. I'm going to read the quote for you, then I'm going to tell you who said it. There is nothing in this world worse than having an opportunity you're not prepared for. Good luck usually follows the collision of opportunity and preparation. You've got to be prepared. So make your mistakes now and make them quickly. If you've made the mistakes, you know what to expect next time, and that's how you become valuable. That is exactly what you taught these young ladies. Your quote is by Quincy Jones. Our second recipient is Dr. Denise Williams-Klotz. Denise, come on up. That's a lot of people out there. Dr. Denise Williams-Klotz has been a contributor to our campus in ways that are far-reaching and long-lasting. Her innovative programming is apparent through numerous appearances, workshops, and programs, reaching audiences in the Greek community, the residence halls, and Cardinal Women at ISU, just to name a few. Her signature initiatives include the Hype and the Spark, programs developed to amplify the voices of our students to employees and administrators at ISU. She is the founder of the Multicultural Student Services Regional Conference, bringing together student services professionals from surrounding states for professional development and collaboration. Her legacy will live through the programs designed to create opportunities for people to connect, to collaborate, and to learn from one another. So Denise, your quote. So if you go to the website for Multicultural Student Affairs and you click on Denise's picture, it's going to say this. Her advice to students: the college experience is a marathon, not a sprint. Take the time to find balance and enjoy the journey. So keeping in the theme of marathon and sprint, they have no idea what I'm going to say. That's why it's so awkward. Right, so here's the deal, right? So I ran every day. And I acquired this sense of self-determination, this sense of spirit that I would never give up, no matter what else happened. Winning is great, sure, but if you're really going to do something in life, the secret is learning how to lose. Nobody goes undefeated all the time. If you can pick up after a crushing defeat and go on to win again, you are going to be a champion someday. And your quote is by Wilma Rudolph. Our third recipient is Liliana Delgado. Nominators wrote, "What makes Liliana an outstanding catalyst for change and a deserving recipient of the Martin Luther King Jr. Advancing One Community Award is that she doesn't simply challenge the status quo. She brings forward well-thought-out recommendations and ideas. She is a strong team player, and she's able to work collaboratively across this university. And she brings a contagious, high-energy drive to her work. While she's become well-known at Iowa State University in recent months, her work and commitment to creating a more inclusive community and reducing injustice has been present for years. As an undergraduate student, she has been a catalyst for positive change with campus-wide impact. Her strategic words and actions are bringing about systemic change aimed at reducing injustice and inequality at Iowa State University. And I will say firsthand, you make a difference." Your quote is one sentence long, and it is tremendously powerful. Liliana's quote, "Give me a place to stand, and I will move this earth." And that's by Archimedes, Greek mathematician. Another round of applause for this year's award winners.
Good evening. Tonight's speaker, a historian and best-selling author, Dr. Ibram Kendi, is one of the nation's most prolific and accomplished professors of race, writing for and speaking to both scholarly and general audiences. A professor of history and international relations, Dr. Kendi's relentless and passionate research puts into question the notion of a post-racial society and opens readers' and audiences' eyes to the reality of racism in America today. Dr. Kendi has published numerous essays in academic journals and periodicals, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Time, just to name a few. In 2019, he was honored on the Route 100, which listed him as the 15th most influential African American between the ages of 25 and 45, and the most influential college professor. Dr. Kendi is the National Book Award-winning and New York Times best-selling author of Stamped from the Beginning, A Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, and How to Be an Anti-Racist. In addition, he is also the founding director of the Antiracist Research and Policy Center at American University. Please join me in giving a warm Iowa State welcome to our 2020 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Legacy Convocation keynote, Dr. Ibram Kendi.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm truly honored to be here, and I am, of course, honored to sort of share with you and to talk to you and to really celebrate, obviously, one of the greatest Americans that ever lived in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And thinking about it from the African tradition, King, because of the way he lived, he died as an ancestor, meaning we remember him and we're going to continue to remember him. And I say that because when I sort of heard the stories and the influence and the impact of these three MLK recipients, it sounds like they're headed towards being ancestors too. And so I just wanted to express my sort of gratitude and honor for Coach and Denise and Liliana. Can we give them another hand of applause? So to be honest, I was somewhat concerned about whether I would actually speak today. And the reason being is because, I don't know if y'all remember, but on New Year's Eve, a small college basketball program from Florida came here to Iowa State and played you in basketball and shocked the country and somehow won. And that school, Florida A&M University, is my alma mater. And so I just wanted to sort of share that there's not going to be any rematch. You had your one opportunity. We are not coming back here ever. And secondly, I was like, you know, I live in Washington, D.C., and I just thought y'all were tired of folk from Washington, D.C. But again, it's an honor to be here. I always enjoy this time of year in which we can really reflect on the real Dr. King, not the Dr. King that we are shown on our television screens, or not the Dr. King in which we seem to only hear one of his speeches on the radio, not the Dr. King we read about in that one paragraph in textbooks. I'm talking about the real Dr. King. I'm talking about the King who once wrote, "When a people are mired in oppression, they realize deliverance only when they've accumulated the power to enforce change." Or even the Dr. King who once said, the business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's home with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than programs of social uplift is a nation that's approaching spiritual death. Or even the King who once wrote from a jail cell in Birmingham, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal that you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Or even the king who once said, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. You see, in the last year of King's life, which is also the year we're not taught about, King became a revolutionary. He considered himself a revolutionary. He considered his struggle to be a part of a revolutionary struggle that was gripping the world. And I can say to you that 20 years ago, as a senior in high school, I participated in an MLK speech competition. And I thought I was a revolutionary too. I thought I was progressive too. I ended up deciding and writing this speech for this competition that I thought was serving Black people. Little did I know that I came of age in the 1990s. And if there was ever a decade in American history when Black youth, in particular, were considered the American problem. Now, some of the college students, gosh, we're so old, for those of us who are not. You may not remember the 90s, but for us older folk, I mean, 20 years ago, I was a high school student. Jesus Christ. But in the 1990s, this was the decade where in many ways American politics revolved around the Black youngster. So you know how like today, Republicans and Democrats and even Republicans are arguing over so-called Latinx invaders? How in many ways Americans are standing on 2 or 3 or 4 sides based on Latinx immigrants? In the 1990s, that central political dividing force were Black youth. And this was a decade in which Black youth were considered to be violent. We were considered to be violent because we listened to too much hip hop that was also violent, even though white kids were listening to the very same songs, but that's another story. And this was a decade in which we were imagined to not value education. And so as a result, this massive schools movement emerged called No Excuses. In other words, we, Black youth and Latinx youth, were making too many excuses. And that's precisely why. That's precisely what was wrong with us. This was a decade in which it was imagined that we were having too many babies, particularly young Black teenage girls. They were imagined to be having all these babies, and they were sexually irresponsible and personally irresponsible. Do y'all remember this? All right, this was the time in which young Black youth were classified by both Republicans and Democrats as super predators. Right, and so I came of age as a Black youngster in the 1990s. You know, when I was 20 years ago, I was 17 years old. And so I didn't realize this, but I had consumed many of those ideas, many of those anti-black ideas about black youth, that they were constantly being produced and force-fed to me as they were being force-fed to every single American. And I didn't realize, again, that I had consumed these ideas. So when I ultimately sat down to write this speech, all of those ideas came out. And so 20 years ago, I stood on a stage before upwards of 3,000 people, most of whom were black. I actually became a finalist in this county-wide competition in Prince William County, Virginia, which is right outside of DC. And in that speech, I said, black youth are the most feared in society, as if it was our fault we were so feared. I criticized black youth for climbing the high tree of pregnancy. I criticized black youth for not thinking. I criticized black youth for putting their energy, all their energies in sports and music. I went on and on about all the things wrong with black youth. Again, while thinking that I was being not racist. While thinking that I was being actually personifying King. In many ways, my speech was a remix of one of King's speeches. I don't think King would call it that, but that's what I called it. And I didn't realize at the time to say something is wrong with a racial group. In the case of this speech, the racial group was black youth. I didn't realize to say something is wrong with a racial group is to say something is inferior about a racial group. I didn't realize to say something is inferior about a racial group is to say a racist idea. I didn't realize that I was serving up racist ideas about my people to my people, all the while not recognizing that the main problem, that the fundamental problem was not black youth, but was everything that was ensnaring black youth. And, when I actually look back to my own experience as a black youngster in the 90s, in which guidance counselors were steering me away from certain classes, in which police officers were steering me towards particular places, I could have easily seen the way in which it was the true problem was racism. But again, these ideas were being mass-produced and mass-circulated, and people all around me, from white people to my parents, were consuming them and telling me that they were true. Does anybody remember this? Was I the only one believing that there was a such thing as a black super predator? Was I the only one thinking that black youth needed no excuses in schools? Was I the only person thinking that there was something wrong with black people or Latinx people or particularly black poor people? Was I the only one? And so ultimately, I've spent the last 20 years coming to grips with the most shameful day of my life. And in many ways, what I first and foremost had to do in coming to grips with that day and even subsequent days, and even days before that, was first admit what I was doing and what I was saying. And the reason why that was so critical for me is because we live in a country in which, in Washington, D.C., and I'm sure here, pundits talk about, I'm sure political candidates are here talking about how we're so divided and they want to bring people together. We're actually quite united. You know the way in which we're united? Americans commonly look in the mirror and see a not racist. We all consider ourselves to be not racist. Whether you're talking about Republicans, Democrats, whether you're talking about conservatives, moderates, liberals, radicals, socialists, it doesn't matter. Whether you're talking about Northerners, Southerners, you're talking about the coast, Central America, you're talking about white people, people of color, no matter what we say about a particular racial group, when we are challenged on that idea, the typical response is, no, I'm not racist. And then some of us are quite radical and say, we're the least racist person anywhere in the world. Even if we just said that majority black Baltimore is a rat and rodent infested mess that no human being would want to live in. Even if we've spent our presidents, anyway, y'all, I don't need to. And so really, where we diverge, where we differ is how much we deny our own racism. As individuals, the racism in our institutions, the racism in our country. That's the only place where we diverge. Some of us deny it more than others. And what's ironic about this denial, this widespread and united denial, the United States of denial, is that there's always been a United States of denial. When this nation was founded by many slaveholders, many of those slaveholders stated that they were, in our terms, not racist. We're actually following God's law. These black people are the cursed descendants of Ham. What are you talking about? We're not racist, or as they would say then, we're not prejudiced. These people are fit for slavery. If anything, they've been spending thousands of years in barbarism in Africa, doing nothing, running around apparently in the trees and each other, until European slaveholders arrived to save them. And now we are civilizing them on the plantation through their fathers and mothers. This is the argument that they made, particularly the last few decades before the Civil War. The preeminent defenders of slavery either made the case that slavery was a positive good, that was the secular argument, or the religious argument that these people are the cursed descendants of Ham. These were the two principal arguments. And so, of course, after the end of slavery and the emergence of Jim Crow, what did Jim Crow segregationists say? Oh, we're not racist. It's perfectly separate but equal. And if anything, it's these outside agitators who are coming in and messing up the harmonious relations between the races. Everything's been great. It was better during slavery, but it's still great. And then, apparently, when the United States signed one act in 1964 and a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act in 1965, apparently, it eliminated all racial inequality and disparities. And so, over the last 10 years or so, we've been talking about, or people like me have been arguing against this idea that this nation is post-racial, but Americans have been arguing it's post-racial for 50 years. And therefore, those Americans who are actually not just seeking to institute law that made it illegal to racially discriminate against a particular people, but even those Americans who were pushing bills like affirmative action, apparently they became the real racist, the reverse discriminators. Because we're post-racial. Everything is okay. We don't need those policies. Anybody know what I'm talking about? And then we started mass incarcerating millions of people, particularly millions of black and brown people. And then it was, we're not racist. These people are violent criminals. And then when people in this room, hopefully, were like, well, actually, the majority of people who are being incarcerated are being incarcerated for nonviolent offenses. And then the majority of those nonviolent offenses are nonviolent drug-related offenses. And the majority of those nonviolent drug-related offenses are possession-related offenses. And the races are consuming drugs at equal rates. And some studies are showing that white people are actually more likely to consume drugs. They're selling drugs at equal rates. Just like I'm sure, I mentioned FAMU earlier. We got drug dealers there, and I'm sure y'all got drug dealers here. But I suspect the police departments, because my university is historically black, and because when most Americans think of a drug dealer, they color the drug dealer black, it allows your drug dealers to do good business if they're white. And people are shaking their head like, yep, I'm going in later. And so you have the races consuming and selling drugs at largely equal rates, but black people being 9 and 10s, and in some jurisdictions 20 times more likely to be arrested and incarcerated for the same crime. But then people are saying we're not racist. And then also what's happening, because there's so much there, but I don't want to take us on a tangent, right? And then, we're mass incarcerating people, and then we start mass deporting people, and not all people, but just people particularly from Latin America and places like Africa. And then it's perceived, it's projected that we're deporting these people because they're what? Violent criminals and rapists. So we're not racist. This is good. We're defending the country. We're making the country safer. And apparently, we're also getting rid of these people who are taking American jobs. And then when you have scholars say, well, actually, studies show when you have an increase in immigration in a community that actually creates jobs, and actually, white people, because of racism, are typically at the front of the line of those jobs. You actually have this scenario in which you have people organizing against their own livelihood. And then they start struggling economically, and then who do they blame? Those very people who could have been the source of their livelihood. As a quick aside, last year, when I read the manifesto the alleged manifesto of the shooter who murdered dozens of people at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas. And what was striking, for those of you who haven't read this manifesto, is he fundamentally talked about having these aspirations to get this dream job. And he felt that, quote, Mexicans were Mexican immigrants, and ultimately he called them invaders, were essentially stealing his dream job, his livelihood. And so he had been mass manipulated to believe that not the political figures he worships, but the very people who are coming into his community, typically fleeing violence, who are likely to be creating jobs, that they are his enemy. Just as in 1860, you had 4 million enslaved black people in the South. You had 5 million poor whites in the South. And many of those poor whites were misled and manipulated into believing that their economic enemies were enslaved black people. And they therefore became the shock troops, literally the military that upheld slavery. Because slavery, despite what they say in the textbooks, slavery was an economic system maintained brutally and regularly by violent terror. And in order to maintain this violence, you need people. You need a show of force. And that show of force was largely poor whites who imagined their aspiration were to be slaveholders. Which, just like you have people today who aspire to be billionaires. And so they essentially oppose the very policies that could actually lift them up into the middle class and even potentially the upper class. They classify those policies as socialist and anti-capitalist and hurtful to them because they're not thinking about what's best for them in their economic position. They're like, if that hurts those billionaires and I'm one day going to become them, it hurts me. I mean, can you imagine this thinking? And then you wonder why. You look at the United States, and working people and middle-income people do not have basic rights and basic care that's guaranteed in other countries around the world. I mean, it is an afterthought. I'm going way on a tangent. So I was recently in Germany. And as many of you know, when you travel, particularly in this political environment, out of the country, people just pepper you with questions. They just don't understand. They don't understand how any American can be against Medicare for all. They just can't understand it. They can't understand how any American would support an anti-union measure in a state, preventing people from unionizing. They can't understand why people are so easily manipulated by racist and sexist ideas. They just can't understand it. And then they try to turn around and say, well, our country is post-racial, and I'm like, okay, now. And so, I'm way off on a tangent. Y'all mind if I bring it back? And so, this denial is deep-seated and historic. And the sound of that denial is not racist. And, you know, when people tell me that they're not racist, I typically respond, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be not racist? What is the philosophy of not racism? What is the history of not racism? Because what I understand, the history of not racism runs through slave traders, runs through slaveholders, runs through colonizers, runs through people who commit mass genocide against Native people. It runs through Jim Crow segregationists, all of whom commonly were denying that they were racist. All of whom were commonly denying that their policies were racist. And what's ironically is even still to this day, Americans still commonly identify themselves in the same way white supremacists do. And so that is one of the reasons why I've been advocating for us as a human community to just drop the term not racist. I mean, what if we dropped that term? What if we eliminated it from our vocabulary? And what if we realized that we were either being racist or anti-racist? And then what if we had very clear definitions of what it means to be racist and anti-racist? Because one of the other things that happens with this denial, one of the reasons why Americans are so easily able to deny that they're racist is because they never define it. If you don't define something, you can always exclude yourself from it. Think about it. You know, people swear to me that they're not racist. And I'm like, you swear? Yes, I swear. You swear? Yes. So you know 100%, without a doubt, you're, quote, not racist. Yes. Okay, so that means you must know what a racist is. And then it's quiet like this. I mean, think about it. You can't know you're not something, and you don't know for sure what that something is. And so that's an indication of how we live in this ideology of denial. That we define racism in a way that excludes and exonerates us. So we have this shifting, non-existent definition. And racist, like anti-racist, like every other word I'm going to use in this speech, has definitions. Have definitions that we can apply to ourselves and to other people consistently. I define a racist idea as any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. Isn't that simple? Any idea that suggests that something is wrong or right with a racial group is a racist idea. Any idea that suggests a particular racial group is better or worse in any way is a racist idea, whether we're talking about genetically, whether we're talking about culturally, or even behaviorally. Now, in many ways, we are raised, we are nurtured to be racist by racist ideas. In many ways, racist ideas are our common sense. And there's so many different things in which we believe, in which indeed it is the case that a particular racial group is more violent, is more lazy, is more intelligent. Probably, to give the example of violence, people believe that black neighborhoods have more homicides, have more violent crime, and so therefore, that demonstrates that black people are more violent. Now, racists argue why black people are more violent. Some say there's a genetic predisposition to violence. Others say it's their sort of culture. But there's this common idea that black people in black neighborhoods are more violent. Does that sound familiar? And it's based on typically violent crime data and homicide data. What's fascinating about this American idea is what that means if the blackness of the people is behind the violent crime, is behind the homicides. What that means is no matter the black neighborhood, they're going to have the same levels of violent crime. But that's not the case. Black middle-income neighborhoods, black upper-income neighborhoods have lower levels of violent crime than black impoverished neighborhoods. And it just so happens to be the case in white America, Latinx America, Asian America, Native America. You have higher levels of poverty, higher levels of unemployment, particularly long-term employment. You're going to have higher levels of violent crime. And it just so happens to be the case that that is the case around the world. So what that means to me is it's actually not, we're not seeing violent black neighborhoods, we're seeing violent unemployed neighborhoods. You see how that flips it? And you see how it then causes us to actually see the true cause, I should say, the true source of the problem. Because if it's truly the case that these people are predisposed to violence, then your solution is, okay, they need more police and more prisons. But if it's a violent, unemployed neighborhood, it completely changes the calculus. Other people would say, well, what about black people indeed are intellectually inferior? Look at the achievement gap. White students and Asian students are getting better scores on average on these tests than black and Latinx students, so that demonstrates empirically, scientifically, that there is this intelligence gap, or as they call it, an achievement gap. Now, again, racists argue over why this achievement gap exists. Some say that there's a such thing as an intelligence gene, and that intelligence gene is prevalent among people of European descent, and it doesn't exist or hardly exist among people of African. Y'all know what I'm talking about? Now, when people like me say, okay, well, what is that intelligence gene? Then they start talking in circles because there is no intelligence gene. Others say it's because these Black and Latinx kids come from broken communities and broken homes and broken parents and broken schools and broken teachers. So, it's environmental. It's not by nature, it's the result of their environment. So we just need to fix those parents and fix those cultures and fix those schools. And then other people like me are like, so you're saying you're using a standardized test to make this case. The same standardized test that was created by eugenicists. The same eugenicist who not only lifted up and reinforced and supported Jim Crow segregation, who not only advocated and pushed through policies that sterilized hundreds of thousands of Black and ultimately Latinx women in the 20th century in the United States, but then also were inspiring people in Nazi Germany. People like Madison Grant, who wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race in 1916, a New York lawyer, that made the case that the great Anglo-Saxon race, so those of you whose ancestry are from Russia or Poland or Italy or Ireland, you're not included. But the great Anglo-Saxon race was being diluted by all these inferior beings from Southern and Eastern Europe, from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America. And this book ended up in the prison in Germany, and someone ended up using this book to write some obscure book known as Mein Kampf. I'm talking about Adolf Hitler, who called The Passing of the Great Race his Bible. I'm talking about Nazi scientists and Nazis who essentially looked at American eugenicists for inspiration. And what is their most lasting achievement? American eugenicists, the standardized test. And so we still use the standardized test to make the case that certain racial groups are superior than others. But not only that, we use the test to legally and regularly exclude people and make them feel as if they are less than because they got less than in the test. All the while, we have the super rich who, as you know, are cheating to get their kids in. And that's the illegal cheating. And then you have the legal cheating, which is, we can pay some money for a high-priced test prep course or get a tutor, and these tutors or these tests will boost our score 200 points, and the admissions officer won't even know. And then I can make the case that I'm smarter because I got 200 points higher because my family had the resources to afford this class when another one didn't. And I'm going to continue to support this multi-billion-dollar test prep industry, all the while I'm imagining that these tests are fair? Anyway, don't get me started. And so there's so many ways in which we believe that certain racial groups are superior and inferior than others. And they're so wired into literally our conceptual DNA that it's hard for us to imagine the ways that the racial groups are equal. And again, when I say equal, I'm not saying that there are no violent Black people. I'm saying there's violent white people too. And don't get me started about what I saw in Richmond the other day. I'm not saying there's no lazy black people. I'm saying that there are lazy white people too. Y'all know them. And no one has ever proven that a particular race has more or less of the positive or negative behavioral traits. People have assumed it, people have conjectured, but people don't have any actual evidence. And so, literally, when to be an anti-racist idea suggests that the racial groups are equal, that no racial group is better or worse than another racial group in any way. And what that means fundamentally is it doesn't just recognize the ways in which, first and foremost, we're genetically the same, that there's really no genetic differences between the so-called races, that at a scientific level, race doesn't exist, that indeed there's more genetic diversity within Africa than between Africa and the rest of the world. Indeed, people in Western Africa are more genetically similar to people in Western Europe than they are to people in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa. That's how much genetic diversity is within Africa. So this idea of these genetic races with white blood and black blood and Latinx diseases, that doesn't exist. But there is a such thing as ethnic difference. And each ethnic group practices a different culture. And while racists tend to standardize their own culture and judge other cultures from their own cultural standard, to be anti-racist is to basically recognize that when we're seeing cultural difference, you know what we're seeing? Cultural difference. That's it. And we may not like it, or we may not want to participate in what we're seeing because we value our own culture. But this idea that that culture needs to be eliminated, this idea that that culture is inferior, this idea that there are problems within that culture, as if there's not problems within our own cultures, those are racist ideas. So an anti-racist levels the cultures, just as she levels the ethnic groups, just as she recognizes that we're genetically the same and we even behaviorally the same. Humans engage in behavior. And even something as fundamental as love. Humans love all over the world. Now, how they love is different in each culture. And to be anti-racist is to respect those differences, but it's a fundamental human trait. That's what humans do. Behavior is what humans do. And very quickly, I didn't mean to, because I only have a few minutes left, but when it comes to racist policy, very simply, racist policies lead to racial inequity and injustice. Anti-racist policies lead to equity and justice. Whether the policies have racial language in them is irrelevant. What's ironic about Americans is so many Americans basically assess whether a policy is racialized or even racist based on whether it has racial language in it. At the same time, most Americans would commonly agree that poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and literacy tests were racist when they had no racial language in them. Most Americans would agree that policies upholding and sustaining slavery were racist, even though the vast majority of those policies had no racial language in them. We should define a policy as racist or anti-racist very simply by its outcome. If it's creating equity, it's anti-racist. If it's leading to justice, it's anti-racist. If it's leading to or maintaining inequity or injustice, it is racist. What if it was that simple? What if we eliminated constructs like race neutral or race conscious, and we were not trying to figure out what's in someone's heart or bones? You know, we have Republicans and Democrats out here saying, I don't have a racist bone in my body, right after they said something that was racist. I mean, what if what was inside people was irrelevant? All we should care about is what people say. All we should care about is the impact of a particular policy. In many ways, that simplifies the struggle, because then you begin to see that there are people who are expressing racist and anti-racist ideas. There are people who are supporting racist and anti-racist policy. And then it allows us to ask ourselves, what are we doing? How are we explaining the racial inequality in this country? What policies and policymakers are we supporting? Are we looking at all forms of racial inequity and disparity and seeing the problem not as people, but as policy and power? Because if we are, then we're being anti-racist. If we are being misled into believing that the problem is people, and we're spending our time going after those people or trying to civilize or develop those people because those people are the problem, because our politicians said so, because our parents said so, because someone said so, we're being racist. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to recognize that. Because fundamentally, the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession, is acknowledgement. That is what Americans have refused to do from the beginning. Admit, confess, acknowledge. And instead, we are still, commonly as a people, this United States of denial. Thank you. So I think we have some time for questions, and I would like, if possible, for the questions to be as concise as possible, and my responses will be as concise as possible so that we can engage as many people as possible. Is that cool?
Okay. Earlier, you talked about one of your worst days. I was just wondering how today was for you.
So anytime I talk about that shameful day, it's a difficult day. But at the same time, I know, even through my own life experience, that, without pain, there's no healing. And so for many of us, when we think about our worst days, sometimes, if not most times, our best days are right after it.
Thank you.
So I recently heard you on the radio talking about today's swing voter and your concept around that. Could you talk a little bit about that to us?
Sure. I thought y'all were tired of politics, but. So I recently wrote this piece for The Atlantic where I write, entitled The Other Swing Voter. When most Americans think of a swing voter, they're thinking of voters who swing from Republican to Democrat. And those voters are almost totally white. And then they think about how all of those Americans who swung from voting for Obama to voting for Trump. And so these Obama to Trump voters are considered the prototypical swing voters. And again, they're almost totally white. And it's stated that their swing was critical in swinging the election from the Democrats to the Republicans. Did that all sound familiar? So in the piece, I talk about the other swing voter, not the voter who swings from voting Democrat to Republican, but the voter who swings from voting Democrat to not voting at all. And typically, these voters assess the Democratic candidate. In the case of 2016, many of them did not like the candidate. And that dislike, combined with being the primary targets of voter suppression, And in the case of 2016, all sorts of Russian trolling to get them to not vote leads some of these people to choose to not vote. So these voters, again, who swing from voting Democrat to not voting at all, are typically young people and are typically people of color, and most especially young blacks voters. And when you look at the 2016 election, more voters swung from voting from Obama to not voting at all or voting third party than swung from voting from Obama to Trump. So in the piece, I argue that this is another critical group of swing voters that particularly Democrats who are likely to win them need to be concerned about. And it is prudent for the party to be concerned about what candidates can attract both the white swing voter and the other swing voter. The other thing I talk about is the reason why these young black voters are not, in a way, valued. And that's another reason why I call them the other swing voter, because young people and black people, and especially young black people, are othered in our society. And in our society, the normal voter, the standard voter, the most valuable voter is the white voter. And so politics revolves around the white voter. And so I just argued in the piece that if the Democrats are serious about winning in November, they should probably take into consideration the other swing voter.
Hi, I don't have a question. I have an invitation to you and anyone else in the audience who likes this sort of conversation. There's actually a conference on critical race theory. This year it will be at the end of May and held at the University of Delaware. And if you're interested in looking it up, it's the Critical Race Studies and Education Association. So if you just Google CRSEA, there's a lot of people talking about anti-racism.
Thank you so much.
Hi, so you talked about the illusion of the post-racial society in America and globally. So I was wondering, do you believe that a truly post-racial society is something that we will actually be able to accomplish in the future? Is it something that's realistic?
So I think it depends on how we define post-racial. And so if we define post-racial as the elimination of racial hierarchy, of racial inequality, of disproportionate amounts of power in certain racial groups, then I do believe it's possible. And I feel like in order to be anti-racist, you're driven by the ability to want to create that type of society. And in order to essentially be a change agent, you have to believe in the possibility of change. What's fascinating is you have so many so-called activists who don't believe in change, which is fundamentally like, you know, a doctor who doesn't believe people can be healed. No, that means you're not an activist. Oh.
Trying to get out of the way,
Sure.
Really tall. A friend of mine pointed me in the direction of Stamped from the Beginning, and so I asked him what question to ask you. So he wrote, ask him how his definition of racism changed to include people of color. In Stamped from the Beginning, he describes how people of color lack the power aspect, but in Antiracist, he changed his view. I'm curious about the evolution.
Well, actually, I didn't change my view.
Okay.
But I think when I was researching Stamped from the Beginning, I expected to primarily chronicle white people who are producing racist, anti-black racist ideas. And the history is it's a history of anti-black racist ideas. And I couldn't escape the fact that there were some crucial black thinkers who were involved in the production or mass circulation of anti-black racist ideas. What I also realized, and I actually sort of talked about this more in How to Be an Anti-Racist, is this idea that people of color more broadly, or black people, don't have power is simply materially and historically inaccurate. People of color have limited amounts of power, but to say black people have no power is to essentially say black people are slaves. Because the only people that have no power are not enslaved people who are resisting, but slaves who are not resisting. And to say that white people are all powerful is to essentially call white people gods. And so you've had this long-standing black resistance. You've had Latinx people and Native people and Asian people resisting racism, partnering with whites to challenge racism and to not acknowledge those people who looked at their own people and said, no, you're not the problem, racism is the problem. And to not acknowledge that some of their own people said, no, we are the problem, don't challenge racism, is to essentially not acknowledge American history.
Thank you for your work and for being here. I'm hoping for a clarification. Would you say that you see it as people are racist people or anti-racist people, or that people engage in racist behaviors, comments, actions, or anti-racist behaviors, comments, actions?
Sure. So I consider racist and anti-racist to be descriptive terms. They describe what a person is saying or doing in any given moment. And what I mean by that is, if in one moment someone is saying a racist idea, in that moment they're being racist. If in the next moment they express an anti-racist idea, in that very next moment they're being anti-racist. And so it's fundamentally rooted in what the person is saying or doing, or in some cases not doing. And so it's not essential to who a person is. No one becomes a racist or an anti-racist. Being a racist or an anti-racist is a reflection, again, of what a person is doing or not doing or saying. The reason why this is absolutely critical is because in my work, I found people who consistently and regularly express both racist and anti-racist ideas, who support both racist and anti-racist policies. So with those people, can we essentially call them racist? No. Can we essentially call them anti-racist? No. And so with those people, and it potentially is the case that most people are probably that way, or at least I like to think that most people are, it allows us instead to be like, okay, you know what, I'm going to describe what you're doing. So there's ideas, there's policies, and there's people. And when a person is expressing a racist idea, in that moment, that person is being racist.
So while I recognize that policy change is necessary in the elimination of racism, I also recognize the inherently hierarchical and oppressive, and therefore oppressive, nature of government. That being said, what are some specific practices outside of government we can exercise to destroy institutional racism? And then also, what can we do as college students from Iowa?
Yeah, so when I talk about policies, sure. So he stated that he understands the role that policy change plays, but then argued that government is inherently hierarchical and described government in other ways, and then stated what are the things that can be done outside of government, and what specifically can students do. Is that, see, I can listen, yeah. So first and foremost, when I talk about policy, I'm actually talking about measures that govern people. So whether that's a student group, whether that's a university, whether that's a neighborhood, an institution, a community, obviously a nation. And so there are policies all around us, governing us. And so to change policy is to change all those policies around us that are leading to, we feel or we see, inequity or injustice. As relates to government, I think it's critical for us to understand that government is made up of policymakers and policies. That's essentially government. And so government is not inherently hierarchical, or it's not inherently egalitarian. It is what the people who are in positions of power in government make it. The reason why I wanted to emphasize that is because I want us to recognize the role that people in policy play. And when I talk about even power, I'm talking about policymakers. And whether that's policymakers in government or whether that's policymakers in your institutional community. These institutions, these governments are what the people make them. And I don't ever want us to forget that, because once we forget that, in a way, we just think it's always been this way and it always will be this way. It's this sort of system that sort of replenishes itself as if there are not actual people and actual interests and actual ideas and actually policies who are behind that.
Do you ingest certain news or media outlets that you trust to be mostly anti-racist, or at least leaning that direction? I want to know what you're reading, basically.
So, I mean, you know, I read, obviously I write for The Atlantic, so I read The Atlantic. I read periodicals like The Intercept, like Nation magazine. Obviously, being in Washington, D.C., I can't get around reading the Post. And, you know, I, like many millennials, get most of my news, or a lot of my news, from social media, what my friends are sharing. So I actually, at least through social media, I'm very deliberate about who I follow, because I recognize who I follow is going to deliver me a certain set of news.
Hello.
What's up?
Okay, so I'm working my way through Malcolm X's autobiography, and one thing I think is really interesting is how, like, him and other people that I've talked to, like, have experienced, people who are really, like, active on the basis of, or politically involving race, have experienced situations where, or experienced childhoods of anti-blackness, of digesting it and then putting it out, probably just because they're, like, active people in general. But I think a lot of people, a lot of black people specifically, spend a lot of their childhood digesting anti-black rhetoric all the time. And so as a black person, do you have any advice for people who are coming out of that era, like that teenage era of realizing all the propaganda they've been digesting and kind of preparing for the anti-blackness they're gonna face even when they leave this room?
So, I mean, you know, I'd say one sentence. The only thing wrong with black people is that we think something's wrong with black people. That's it.
So I'm going to school here to be an elementary educator, and I was just wondering if you had either any advice or something you wish your childhood teachers would have done to help you get rid of that, I guess, anti-black mentality.
So, I mean, I think the most important thing that a teacher can do is train herself or himself, first and foremost, by acknowledging their own racist ideas and essentially going on a path to be anti-racist. It's just like a parent, right? Whether you're a teacher or you're a parent, the most effective thing you can do for your children, for your students, is strive to be anti-racist yourself, is ensuring that you're on that path. And the reason why is because what you say and what you do on a daily basis is going to be a function of whether you're holding and consuming and believing racist and anti-racist ideas. And you're not even gonna know it. And you're likely to deny it, right? The second thing is obviously the curriculum, right? And so ensuring that not only you have sort of diverse representation within the curriculum, that you're teaching cultural difference, you're teaching students to appreciate and even seek to understand and learn about cultural differences, literary differences. But then you're also teaching them fundamentally to be anti-racist. You're talking through inequities and injustices And you're asking students, okay, why does this inequity and injustice exist? And then that fundamental question then leads to either racist or anti-racist answers. And then when we give racist answers, you sort of teach them why those answers are not based in fact. I mean, essentially, that's what I would advocate.
Hi. I go to DMAC, and so I just learned about the importance of voting. And so as I am reading about things in the news, and I just want to know, like, how do I start a change? I have a son, he's back there. His graduating class is 2037, so I want to know how I can start the change, not just for my generation, but for his generation outside of voting. What can I do outside of just being cautious of who I vote for and what I'm contributing to society?
So I think first and foremost, each of us should think about the issues and the sectors and the spaces that we're most passionate about. And chances are, in those spaces involving those issues, there's an organization or there are people who are already active, challenging social injustices or whatever social injustice we're most passionate about. And then it's for each of us to join those people, to figure out ways in which our talents can be useful to those people. And some of us may not have the time to join those organizations or much time to join them and to participate, but we may have some money, so we could support those organizations. That's critical. Or we may have a little bit of time and a little bit of money, so we can contribute the little bit we have to those organizations, to those campaigns that are driving for policy and power change. And fundamentally, organizations that are focused on power and policy change are going to be the organizations that create a different type of America, for your child, not trying to civilize and develop people who are already civilized and developed.
So before I ask this question, I want to preface this with a comment. So I'm on the autism spectrum, and so my lived experience here at Iowa State has been that I haven't received a lot of support. I mean, it's not a holistic thing, but I haven't received a lot of support from some members of the LGBTQ and from the Black community. And so this is the context of my question. So with regard to LeBron James' comments on China, with respect to President Obama's immigration policy before Trump, how do we conceptualize these difficult topics? How do we talk about them, and how do we initiate these conversations if we're striving to be anti-racist and striving towards anti-racism? How do we do that?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's critical for each and every one of us to not make individuals representatives of particular groups. And what that means is that if a person from a particular group mistreats us, that's an individual who's mistreating us. That's not that particular group. And the reason why that's critical is because one of the ways in which we sort of reinforce our own racist ideas or our sexist ideas or our ableist ideas is by taking individual negative behavior and generalizing it. And so I think that that's absolutely critical. But I also think it's critical for us to recognize this sort of intersections of forms of bigotry. So to give an example, my brother has a learning disability. And because he's Black, male, and have a learning disability, he is subjected in particular ways that Black males without learning disabilities, or even white males with learning disabilities, are not. I remember a few years ago when he got into altercation or an argument with my parents, and he called the police. And you talk about, I think I lived about 15 minutes away, and I wouldn't tell you how fast I drove. But I feared for his life and the life of my parents, because I've witnessed so many police officers shoot and kill Black disabled people. Even in that same town that I was living in, a 15-year-old who, called the police threatening suicide, and the police show up, and he's holding a toy gun, and they try to, quote, talk him down, but eventually they shoot and kill him. And so I'm just saying that to say that I think it's absolutely critical for us, when we're thinking about not just racial equality, for us to think about human equality, and for us to realize the ways in which these bigotries are reinforcing each other, and for us to realize that if we build a truly anti-racist nation, that we won't just have rid this nation of racial oppression, but we would have rid all the other forms of oppression, because racism is reinforcing every other form of bigotry, just as every form of bigotry is reinforcing racism. And so really, this racial project is a human project. And we, particularly as a country, over the last year, we're coming sort of face to face, not only with the Armageddon of climate change. The last few weeks, we've come face to face with the Armageddon of nuclear war. And all the while, we've been facing the Armageddon of bigotry. These are the three lethal weapons threatening human existence: bigotry, climate change, and nuclear war. And so for me, this isn't just like a habit. This isn't just a campaign. This isn't just an intellectual exercise. This is literally saving humanity.
I appreciate the congruency of your answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kendi, for joining us and sharing your thoughts. We're grateful for your presence this evening. You've given us much to think about and reflect upon. Please join me in another round of applause for our keynote speaker, Dr. Ibram Kendi. As we move toward the conclusion of the program, please welcome Dr. Vernon Hurt, our Associate Vice President and Dean of Students, to the podium for closing remarks. Dr. Hurt.
Let's show Dr. Kendi some love once more for. Thank you. Thank you for being here at Iowa State. Thank you for challenging us and really pushing us. One of the things that was clear from your remarks is that in order for a community to move forward, the community must move forward. And what I mean by that is the community is the collective of the individuals. And so in order for any community, whether it's a campus community, whether it's the city, whether it's the country, in order for that community to move forward, we must individually do our work to move forward. And it's the collective individual work that helps the community move forward. And so I think that's part of the challenge for us as a community, as a part of a challenge for us individually, is are we willing to do the individual work in order for our community to move forward? And so we thank you for challenging us both personally but as a community on tonight. Certainly want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to be here and to share in this gathering, this MLK convocation. It's a time of celebration and a time of reflection. And so as we think about celebration, let's once again congratulate and thank our recipients of our awards tonight for their work and their impact in a positive way on this community. And certainly, finally, the annual MLK Legacy Series received support from numerous offices, departments, and programs across campus. But I'd like to acknowledge the co-sponsors that have helped make tonight's convocation and keynote speaker possible. The Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, the Colleges of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the Ivy College of Business, Design, Engineering, Human Sciences, Liberal Arts and Sciences, and Veterinary Medicine, the African and African American Studies program, the Department of History, Department of Sociology, University Libraries, Ames Public Library Friends Foundation, the YWCA Ames ISU, and the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by student government. Let's thank all of our co-sponsors for tonight's event for their commitment. Again, on behalf of our president, on behalf of our senior leadership, on behalf of the entire Iowa State community, I want to thank you for taking the time to be here, and certainly hope that this time has inspired us to continue to do our individual work so that our community can continue to move forward as a community. Thank you. Have a great evening.
If you would like to have a book signed, you can line up out here on the Oak Room, which is on the left side. There's also books for sale if you haven't